joining us, Michael.
Thank you, Wendy. I'm delighted to be here because, as you can hear, I've had a history in Portland. I love Portland. It is my second home. It's a place that I've been, for many years been involved here. So The Death and Life of Downtown Portland. That's an allusion to the great book of Jane Jacobs. Many of you know The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And I think where we are in Portland right now, clearly we've got a critical situation. I think everybody recognizes that. But I'm hoping that this talk I'll give tonight provides some optimism, some sense of the bigger picture here, the history of Portland as a city that has gone through other periods like this in the past and come out of them. And there are great resources here, fantastic resources really, that I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to do it in the context of Jane Jacobs' book. Again, I've spent a number of years here in Portland thinking about the challenges of the city. I not only travel around and talk to people about their challenges and what maybe specific recommendations can be made, but I also work in my day job, so to speak, on actually building these kinds of places, getting affordable housing built, getting walkable mixed-use communities built, and dealing with places that are struggling, as indeed Portland is right now, and many cities are. This is not just a Portland problem. And I'm going to talk about Jane Jacobs' great book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And what she pointed out, she was talking about New York in that book. And New York went through some tough times and came out of them and has had a renaissance. And the point that she made was that that happened as the result of choices that people made. The struggles happened as a result of choices, and the Renaissance happened as a result of choices. And that happens in cities all over the world and throughout history. Yes, there are historic forces, but there are also choices that we can make that can promote a Renaissance, promote a great success after a period of struggle as we're experiencing now. My own history goes back to when I was an undergraduate at Evergreen and coming through Portland in the 1970s. And then I've lived in the area, parts of the region for a number of years and know the city very well. And back in the 1970s, you may remember, even going back to the 1960s, Portland was a struggling town. The problems that we have today were in many ways nothing compared to coming out of this post-industrial period, like a number of cities across the United States, the sort of hollowed out core, everybody going out to the suburbs. We're experiencing a little of that now, but it was epidemic at that time. And in fact, it looks like there was nothing but cars in the center of Portland. If you look at some of the photos, a very car-dominated pattern. Robert Moses, who was Jane Jacobs' nemesis in New York, traveled around the country and promoted building freeways that cut through the middle of cities and cut them to pieces, really, encouraged people to get in their cars and drive through the cores and go out to the suburbs and so on. The red ones are the ones that were built, as you probably recognize. The green ones were the ones that were opposed by the citizens. In fact, that was an important moment of catalyzing citizen opposition to this way of doing things, this evisceration of cities, as Jacob referred to it, and embracing what we had here, what we still have, the remarkable heritage, the splendid walkable urban fabric, the world-class architects like A.E. Doyle, who did the Central Library and other great buildings around the area, Wade Pipes, who studied in England and came back and did a very unique Northwest arts and crafts style here, and other architects. And of course, the craftsman architecture that was really affordable, relatively affordable at the time. And Gustav Stickley, who promoted the craftsman architecture, that was very much their goal, was to make housing that was diverse and affordable for a lot of different people. And we have that heritage now still to this day. And yes, we have very splendid homes as well, and splendid neighborhoods and splendid commercial districts and so on. But coming out of World War II, there was a sense that, no, we've got to get modern. We've got to tear down the old Portland Hotel and promote auto mobility. That was the parking lot that is where Pioneer Square is now. And this was going on not only in the core, but all over the city, this wave of demolitions, epidemic of demolitions, and then replacement with this sort of regrettable mid-century buildings, I think. I know there's a fashion to embrace them, but I think that's a bit of nostalgia run amok, because these were not buildings that were particularly friendly to pedestrians. They were made for cars. They were made to drive by fast and not particularly cozy with those blank panels and spandrels and so on. And again, auto-dominated pattern that was happening all over the city and all over the region, and destroying neighborhoods that were viable, what the writer James Baldwin referred to as Negro removal, a really disgraceful episode, to be sure, in our history, and replacing them with these auto-dominated places. So here we are in the 1980s and 1990s and thereabouts. Portland has become a poster child for good urban planning, right? The core is revived. We're having a renaissance. How did we get to that point? Well, I know many of you know this story. In 1970, there was increasing opposition to this auto-dominated way of eviscerating our city core. A lot of grassroots political activism. A new council was elected. Tom McCall came into office around that time and enacted Senate Bill 100. To create an urban growth boundary that essentially put a pricing signal towards the core, that now we're going to reinforce the core. We're not just going to go outward forevermore. And the Harbor Freeway was demolished. Pioneer Square property was acquired. Metro was created. The first light rail opened. The 2040 growth concept was created, which I'll talk about in a little more detail. And I think we all recognize, the city leadership and the activists recognized, that the architectural heritage was critical and that we could build on it. We didn't have to contrast with it or turn our backs on it or indeed demolish it, that we could regenerate Old Town and Ankeny, and we could build Pioneer Square in a respectful revival of some of the historic architecture that was very human-oriented and human-focused and very successful in doing so, and building on the streetcar patterns and the small walkable blocks. You know, Jane Jacobs came to Portland and talked about how lucky we were to have this urban fabric, these small walkable blocks. And if you will, the DNA of place, this sort of fine-grained, diverse, lively neighborhood structure that is really a wonderful asset, and was then and still is. And learning from people like Jane Jacobs, who, as I said, came to Portland and advised Christopher Alexander, whose pattern language methodology was taken up by the University of Oregon, and other postmodern reformers of that time who said, we've got to return to a human-centered kind of urban planning and architecture. And again, there was a regional aspect to this that was critical to regenerate the sprawling suburbs as well. And that's a work in progress, to be sure. But it was something that was very important as part of thinking about the whole region as a system, not just one part of it. And this was a report in 2009 about how to implement the 2040 plan. I was part of this report, Gil Kelly and a number of others who really looked carefully at how we were going to implement this plan regionally. And I want to come back to that a little later and give some specifics and drill down into some specific recommendations. And there was a sense that the political activism was much more united, I think, than it is today, that there were coalitions of people who were committed to civil rights and to racial equality and to preservation, historic preservation, and to foreign policy issues that were especially hitting hard the African-American community at that time, and so on. This was seen as all part of one systemic problem that we had to confront, and we had to be united to do that. And that was a very important component, I think. And we paid attention to the basics, to clean, attractive, livable neighborhoods, to streetscapes that were clean and well-maintained and safe. And this was something that I think we recognized at the time, and perhaps we've lost sight of. I'll talk about that more later, that we must pay attention to the fundamentals if we're going to get anywhere on all the other issues. And Portland, of course, has been celebrated, rightly so, around the country and around the world, that it's a city that has spearheaded urban livability with growth boundaries, public transportation, citizen participation, and neighborhood associations at the forefront of a movement to create livable urban regions and so on. And much was achieved. We can take a lot of pride in that, and we shouldn't forget how much has been achieved. This is the Harbor Freeway on the left, and this is the Tom McCall Waterfront Park. And neighborhood associations were critical partners in that. And I think we all need to recognize that. This emphasis on livable heritage did not compromise economic development, as many naysayers said at the time. You guys are quixotic, you're just a bunch of hippies, and you want Portland to be all about neighborhoods and funky character and quality of life and so on, but we need to be with it and more economically, based on the new modern car culture and so on. On the contrary, this put Portland on the map as a desirable destination, its livable qualities, and it helped to spark similar movements in Seattle, Vancouver, Los Angeles, and elsewhere. Now, my former hometown of Austin has done the same thing. Austin is growing by leaps and bounds, and we can maybe talk about the difference between Austin and Portland, but certainly Austin embraced the Portland model of livability as a sort of economic driver of the city's prosperity. And yet, many of us have been concerned for quite a while, not just in the last couple of years, that we've lost the plot. I'd say we, all of us together, I'm not pointing fingers at anybody individually here, that we've become too complacent. We've rested on our laurels. Maybe we've believed our own hype a bit too much. And we've fallen prey to simplistic silver bullet thinking, regressing to the old failed modernist approaches and single variable thinking and so on. And maybe part of it is we've let money and power corrupt our thinking, something that we've always have to be on guard against, I think. And this idea that we can build our way out of our problems just by selecting one variable like housing supply, I think is very dangerous because it has not resulted in success. This is something that we've been talking about for a number of years now. There's Wendy and our dear friend Suzanne Leonard on the lower right. And we're not the ones that are too tall in that picture. At any rate, we were concerned at the time and still concerned that this single variable thinking is not going to solve our problems. In fact, in many ways, it's made them worse. And this idea that we just need to demolish our way and build our way to new structures, new housing supply, and so on, and new this sort of formulaic, generic global architecture, if you will, that is not rooted in the local heritage, not rooted in place and human placemaking. And I say this from a critical position against my own profession of architecture. I have my Ph.D. in architecture. I love architecture, but I think we have failed to embrace the collective intelligence of evolutionary history. We've fallen prey to starchitecture, which is really a glitzy artistic packaging over a questionable global industrial product, a Western industrial product, an architecture of fashion, of novelty, and not an architecture of place and people. And ultimately, this is not sustainable. It is contributing to our problems, to our crisis, really. And I am by no means the only person saying this. Many leading architects, in fact, are talking about this crisis of the professions, architecture and planning. Rem Koolhaas talks about the failure, the hoax, the magic that didn't work of modernism's alchemistic promise. Frank Gehry talks about 98% of what gets built and designed is pure shit. Peter Eisenman talked about the late period of modernism. We're stuck in it, this Rococo phase that we want to get out, but we can't figure out how to. Then Peter Buchanan, the architecture critic, calls for a big rethink, says that we need to recognize that the modernist and neo-modernist approach we're taking today is unsustainable to its core. Many, many people are talking about this. And Jane Jacobs, going back to 1961, and many other critics back then were talking about this, talking about the pseudoscience of planning and architecture that seems almost neurotic in its determination to imitate empiric failure and ignore empiric success, failing to learn from the regrettable mistakes of the past, in fact, doubling down on some of those mistakes. And not to pick on the modernist architects too much, the hack traditional is also very destructive and very lamentable in many parts of the region, no question about it. But the point is that the architectural leadership is missing, the leadership of the culture of building, if you will, that people like Gustav Stickley and Frank Lloyd Wright and others were calling on the profession to do. And the idea that grassroots democracy is an essential ingredient in dealing with our problems, in harnessing that energy and that collaborative problem solving. This is something that the city of Portland's website crows about even now. And yet this is what many of you know, the policy director for the former commissioner who was responsible for the neighborhood association system, not popular among the neighborhood associations, I would think is a fair statement, is voicing, I think, an opinion of a lot of people, unfortunately, that we need to put neighborhood associations in their place. They are too powerful. They're the enemy. We need to fight them. We need to oppose them. We need to be in battle, essentially, against these people and shove down their throats what they don't like, because that's going to solve our problems. I think, friends, that this is part of a larger mentality that's going on all across the country, the divisiveness that we see all across the country and all across the globe that is pitting people against each other, failing to unite us in order to solve our problems, as we must do if we're going to get anywhere. And it's certainly making the tech companies a lot of money. Maybe that's the ultimate goal behind all of this. But at any rate, there are more collaborative platforms out there. There are ways to work collaboratively and more intelligently together. Wikipedia, to take a trivial example of something on the web that actually comes out of Christopher Alexander's pattern technology, as a matter of fact, and Open Plans, which is a New York City-based collaborative platform for solving urban issues and so on. So there are ways to do this. There are ways to come together and to collaborate, to create a collaborative civic commons, if you will. And another point is that when we make the rules of the game certain ways, we can encourage collaboration or we can encourage divisiveness and fighting. We need to recognize that. And I'll give you an example, a kind of funny example of a parent bringing a couple of slices of cake to the kids. And what are they going to do? The kids are very likely going to fight over the slices of cake, right? Well, what if the parent comes along and says, actually, you, child number one, are going to cut the cake, and you, child number two, are going to pick the first slice. What you're going to see is that child number one is going to cut that slice unbelievably carefully, right? In a way that is the fairest possible division of that slice. So the rules of the game are rewarding cooperation. That's a very important idea, I think, in terms of how we think about how we structure our institutions and our collaborative mechanisms in a place like Portland. By the way, this is DALL-E 2, the AI software, and that's another scary topic when it comes to technology and social media, but that's another talk for another day, perhaps. But there are other platforms that we can use and should use, I think, that are not only here in Portland, but nationally and internationally. UN Habitat and the Habitat 3 conference that Wendy mentioned, where people are coming together and sharing their lessons city to city, peer to peer. The International Making Cities Livable that our dear friend Suzanne Leonard started, that we're running it again this year. We're doing it with Prince Charles's, or now the King's Princess Foundation. Many other parts of the world that we can learn from, and we can share lessons about what is working, what is not working, learning from our successes as well as our mistakes, and learning from our own history and from thoughtful scholars like Jane Jacobs. Jacobs in Death and Life makes some very important points. One of them is we have to understand, if we're going to get anywhere, the kind of problem we're dealing with when we deal with cities. If we don't understand that, we're going to continue making the same mistakes and we're going to see the same problems, which I think is what we're seeing. And she talked about how science coming into the early 20th century had mastered two variable problems really well, like the relationship between a gas pressure and a gas volume, that kind of problem. Then we began to understand statistical problems really well, problems of average populations. But we skipped over, she said, a kind of great middle region, the problem that she referred to as problems of organized complexity, where it's not just the number of variables and it's not just two variables, it's a kind of web network of variables, or a situation in which they're interrelated into an organic whole, as she put it. And these are the kinds of problems that are especially important for cities. So if we don't understand that, and we think that, for example, if we don't have enough housing affordability, then the way to deal with that is housing supply, a two variable problem. It's housing demand, housing supply, right? Well, Vancouver tried that and built a whole lot of housing, and it did not reduce housing costs. In fact, if anything, Vancouver is still one of the most expensive cities in the world. If we think about traffic problems, for example, as statistical problems, and well, we just need to widen the streets and we need to allow more movement across the system. Well, that doesn't work either, because it doesn't account for induced demand and the fact that people have choices, and there's interactive effects, dynamical effects. And we need to understand that this is the kind of problem that's especially important in cities, the problems that exist at the neighborhood scale when different elements are interrelated with one another, like over here by Powell's, where you've got the streetcar and this crossing light and the bookstore and all these elements acting together as part of a system. We have to understand that this is the nature of our problems, that they're related in this way. And they present situations in which a half dozen or several dozen quantities are all varying simultaneously. And there's not just one two variable relationship that explains it, or even one problem in organized complexity, which explains all. And as long as we don't understand that, city planners, business people, lenders, legislators cling to these unexamined assumptions, then we found the shortest distance to a dead end. And I think, frankly, that is very much the case in many cities around the world today, not just Portland. There are other great insights from that book, many of you know, and I highly recommend the book if you haven't read it or reread it. I teach a course on it, and it's amazing how relevant it is. She talked about the importance of diversity and generators of diversity, like the mix of uses, small blocks, walkable blocks, diversity of building age and uses, concentration of people and activities, and so on. And the lowly sidewalk, the public realm, which is where we mix with other people unlike ourselves. And that's so critical. And we form connections that we wouldn't otherwise form. This is what the sociologists call weak ties. You know, you're walking down the street with a friend and they say, oh, here's somebody else. You guys should meet. This person is starting a new business or whatever. That's the propinquity and serendipity, the closeness and the accidental encounter that turns out to be really important for generating creativity and economic activity, knowledge spillovers, economic spillovers. And there's a lot of research on that now, that this is very, very important. Then it's a great asset that Portland has, that downtown Portland has, and you should keep that in mind when you start thinking about decamping to the suburbs. That is not going to be, unless the suburbs have similar kinds of public spaces. A number of people, prominent economists and others, have been influenced by Jacobs, people like Edward Glaser, Richard Florida, many of you have heard of, talking about the creative class. However, we have to bear in mind that if a little is good, it doesn't always follow that a lot is better. If 2 aspirins are twice as good as 1 aspirin, does it follow that 100 aspirin are 100 times as good as 1 aspirin? Clearly not, right? There are issues of scale, things that don't necessarily scale up. And to their credit, both Florida and Glaser have recognized that they've maybe failed to account for the dark side of this, urban creative approach, this idea of only creating agglomeration benefits and making the cores white hot and dealing with the top of the pyramid, so to speak, and leaving everybody else behind, thinking that it'll trickle down. This is similar to the idea of trickle-down economics or supply-side economics that George Bush famously criticized in the 1980s. You may remember that if you focus on the top of the pyramid, it will trickle down to everybody else. And clearly, we don't have a lot of people included in that mix. We have record income inequality, record numbers of people who have been left behind, not only in the urban region, but nationally, the left behind regions who are very resentful of the urban cores, and a lot of resentment and anger that is manifesting in populist politics and other forms that are destructive. So the idea that we should focus on the core, including downtown Portland, and jam new buildings in it, I think is an example of this top of the pyramid thinking that we just need to create this sort of white hot nuclear reaction in the core. We need to build tall buildings and bring in wealthy people and have, the top of the pyramid doing all this wonderful economic activity, the urban elites and so on. And it's all going to trickle down to everybody else, without taking care of everybody else, taking care of people who are low income and homeless and all the rest of it. You can't do that and expect it to work. You can't approach it with a silver bullet approach of that kind. We know from some of the research in, for example, network theory, that it's not just the core of the network, the rich club networks, as they call them, or the small world networks, but the entire network that generates benefits. There's something called Metcalfe's law, which says that your network gets stronger when you have more people plugged into it because everybody's contributing. And when you exclude people, they not only require social services, and maybe there's more crime and there's more policing and all the rest of it, but you've lost their creative input to the economy of the region, to what you can become as a region when you take that kind of approach. So we need to think polycentrically, not only about the core, but also about the solutions to our problems and how we can be more joined up in our thinking. But speaking about the region and the core, I want to talk a little bit more about this idea that it's not just a single variable like housing supply, but it's a balance of factors. And this is true with the question of gentrification and something I like to call the Jacobs curve. Jacobs talked about the need for diversity, the need for people not only to not have wealthy cores and gentrification, right, but also not to live in low-income areas or slums. People don't want to live in exclusively low-income areas and not have opportunities. They want to be somewhere in between, right? They want to be in this optimum zone of high diversity and a mix of low-income and high-income. And we, as policymakers and practitioners, need to make sure that that is where we should be. We need tools. We need economic strategies to promote opportunities for everybody, not just the top of the pyramid. And we need to protect against displacement. We also need to use tools to avoid tipping over into what Jacobs called the self-destruction of diversity. In fact, we need to make sure that we can arrest that tipping over into gentrification, which we unfortunately have not done a good job of in this region, I don't think. And what kinds of tools am I talking about? Well, many of you know tax policies, targeted funding, catalytic projects, amenities, land trust, guaranteed rents, and a well-connected public realm that gives everybody an opportunity that is safe and clean and not just left to, people who are homeless or people who are one income category or another. It's a place for everyone to share the public realm, shared amenities and gathering places, and targeted strategic interventions. And I want to go back to this report from 2009, because again, this was 14 years ago now, that there have been a number of proposals on the table that have been discussing these kinds of approaches that I really think we should take more seriously now, especially in the wake of our current problems, recognizing there is a lot of opportunities for infill, but we need to unlock that infill with careful catalytic tools. We need to recognize the importance of public buy-in. We are in a democracy. We need to recognize that people have a right to participate in the public process, and we need to make them allies, not enemies. We need to recognize that we need sustained collaboration between different sectors. We need institutional platforms to do that. We need to overcome the present obstacles and create new mechanisms to further this development and to unlock these sites. And I'm going to come back to that point in a little more detail later, to recognize we still have many barriers to good quality, walkable mixed use for everybody around the region. And we need to recognize the need for toolkits that we need to assemble. I would think of it as plug and play toolkits that make it possible. Design prototypes, pre-approved designs perhaps, that are already bought into by the neighborhood, pre-reviewed by the city and so on. Design standards that are already approved. I'll talk about that in a little more detail. what we can recognize is, yes, we've got to overcome NIMBYism, not in my backyard, no growth. But we also can't just expect people to say, YIMBY, yes, in my backyard, build, baby, build whatever you want. Because people do have a concern about whether what is being built is going to degrade their quality of life, their livability, and so on. And they have the right to do that in a democracy. They are citizens, after all. They are the people whose homes and neighborhoods are going to be affected by this. So I think we need to recognize that part of this Quimby approach, you might say, is using an evidence-based approach, following A.E. Doyle's idea that we're going to preserve the beauty of the city and add to it. We're not going to detract from the city in the name of some theoretical goal of housing units or whatever. We're going to build on the public realm, our urban commons. We're going to not demonize one another and throw different groups under the bus. We're going to build collaboration, trust, and multilateral solutions at the outset. Remember the game theory thing and cutting the cake and all of that. The best benchmark of sustainability is what has already sustained. And we need to believe in the public process. If we are true Democrats, small d, I hope we are. This is another blog post that I've published nationally, and I've been invited to speak on this internationally. I think people around the country and around the world are hungry for something like this. The idea that we need to recognize that we have to rethink gentrification and affordability, and this quality in my backyard may offer a path. Again, following Jane Jacobs' insight that if we don't understand the kind of problem we're dealing with, we've got the shortest distance to a dead end. And unfortunately, that still rings true after 60 years. We need to be careful not to try to solve for a two-variable problem, whatever that may be. Yes, we do need more housing supply, but it matters what we build and where we build, right? We can't just build skyscrapers for the wealthy and expect that to work for everybody. There may be a little bit of the filtering effect, but that is a small percentage, and it's clearly not working in places like Vancouver. Maybe we need to start by giving our fellow citizens their democratic due, including neighborhood associations. We cannot simply attribute simplistic and malevolent motives. Racism may well be a factor, often is a factor, unfortunately, but so are other factors, including the idea that maybe I'm going to lose my quality of life, whatever that is. And we don't do ourselves any favors by simply focusing on the human failings of other people that we need as collaborators if we're going to get anywhere. I think we've gotten to a point where this is painfully evident. And we need to respect the aesthetic evaluations of existing residents. There's a lot of research on this, that lay people, so to speak, have different aesthetic evaluations than professionals like me and like architects and planners. And we're building for them, not for ourselves. You know, we have a duty of care, I think, to make sure that they are comfortable and find it livable, find it desirable, find it to be a place that they want to be in, because it's their homes and they're in a democracy. And we need to recognize that it is not really the players, it's the game that we have to restructure here. We need to restructure the public involvement process. And I think, frankly, the neighborhood association system needs to be restructured in Portland. A bigger topic, perhaps, than this conversation. I mentioned economic tools, taxation tools, fees, fee baits, incentive, disincentives, ways to unlock many more sites, including the corridors, wasteful landscape setbacks, underutilized parking lots, dying malls, and all the other places. There are lots and lots of sites around Portland that we can unlock in a polycentric way, not just in the core. And we can convert people to become Quimbys. You all probably saw this report recently that just came out. I agree with a lot of it, that we need to think about how to repurpose a lot of this office that is not going to be coming back anytime soon, bring in more housing, more culture, more entertainment, more education, more destinations downtown. The only thing I would add to that is we've got to do that in the broader context of the region and think polycentrically, as I've been saying. So in closing, a couple of key points here. One is COVID-19 has clearly caused major devastation, not only for Portland, but for cities around the globe. And there's no question about that for what it's done to businesses, to office space, and many others, retail and so on. And the 2020 protests have been devastating, and the political divisions that have been part of that. But I think a key point we should understand and build upon is the idea that the structural problems predate these events. They were already happening, and these events were catalysts for what has happened as a result. And the structural solutions are there too, if we will look more carefully for them. A couple of concrete recommendations I'm going to make here. Understand what we have to work with from history, what we have in our small blocks, our urban fabric, and so on. Understand what we have to work with in each other, not only each other here in Portland, but nationally and internationally. Tend to the fundamentals: clean, safe streets and public spaces. That's got to be a priority before we do anything else. Tend to the fundamentals of human services. I think we need an Apollo program to address homelessness and to address affordability. Housing, giving people addresses, giving them jobs. Perhaps they can become people who tend to the public realm and improve it. Assess and learn from past mistakes, including this idea of voodoo urbanism, as I referred to it. Stop demonizing and get to work with everyone, not just a selected few. Don't demonize a select few, and don't tokenize a select few that you think are going to now be representative of some group that you think has been excluded. You've still got the thumb on the scale. That is not a democratic approach. You need to be meaningfully inclusive and develop a new collaborative platform building on the 2009 Metro report, as I discussed, this idea of Quimby and plug and play urbanism and so on, other good work that's been ignored for too long, learning from these simplistic and failed approaches that have gotten us to where we are, build an evolving toolkit of proven solutions. And I do think the evidence is very encouraging. I hope I leave you with an inspiring and hopeful point, which is that a renaissance is possible, as history shows, but it's going to require us to learn from history and from the evidence. And on that note, I'll close from this quote that's attributed to Mark Twain. It actually isn't Mark Twain, I don't think, but it's a good one anyway. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme a lot. Thanks, everybody.